Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. Three-part series, PowerShell for Audit, Compliance, and Security Automation and Visualization. Part 1, Introduction to Automation with PowerShell. I'm going to go ahead and put the next two links for the next two webcasts. They're next Thursday and the Thursday after at the same time, 10:30 a.m. ET. So you can go ahead and click on that link to register for the parts 2 and 3. My name is Carol, author of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Clay Risenhoover, Certified SANS Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Clay.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction, Carol. I'm excited to get some time with all of you to do this three-part webcast series. Today is really going to be all about PowerShell and what it is and how it works. We're going to do a whole lot of demonstrations today, but I guess before I get to that, I should probably introduce myself and let you know what the agenda looks like for today. My name is Clay Risenhoover. I'm a principal instructor with the SANS Institute. I'm the author of the current Audit 507 course, and I'm also the author of the upcoming SEC 557 course. And a lot of the material that we're going to cover over these three webcasts will be previews of the material that will be available in SEC 557. I'm an auditor by trade these days. I'm a CPA. Most of my professional certifications are audit or compliance related, but I grew up as a developer, as an operations person, and as an information security person. And so that kind of broad range of experience informs the way that I go about doing my audit and compliance work. We're going to be, over the next 3 weeks, looking at how to use some of the same technologies that our operations staff are using in order to gather the security or the audit or the compliance information that we need to gather. And I would like to take just a moment here to find out a little bit about the people that are attending the webinar today. So we're going to post a poll question for you, and I'd like you to tell me, what is your job role? I'll leave that open for several seconds for everyone to answer. Okay, very good. So it looks like we have got mostly people who would call themselves InfoSec folks here, with just a few saying compliance and audit, and about a sixth of you saying that you're either IT operations or management. And then we've got that 7% who seems pretty similar to me and calls themselves something else entirely. But it looks like about 61% of you are saying that you're in an InfoSec role. The techniques that we look at during this webinar series are going to work, I think, equally well for people in any of the roles that were mentioned here. Now, SEC 557 is really a part of two different curriculums at SANS. We're part of the management curriculum, and I think that that really makes sense. It really is a compliance class, and so we're going to talk about how do we gather the compliance information that we need quickly and report it both to senior management at kind of that strategic level that they can really understand, and to our operations folks at a tactical level that they can understand. But we're also part of the cloud security curriculum because we will be looking at cloud technologies in SEC 557 as well. So it's really exciting for me to have a course where we kind of bridge that gap between some of the technologies that we teach people how to secure, and then how do we gather information from those technologies and bring that to management to help management do their jobs as well as possible. So this is just part one of a three-part series. And today I'm really going to introduce you to PowerShell as an operating environment and talk about how we can use PowerShell to begin doing a little bit of measurement and reporting to management. Now that's not really the goal today, to do a whole lot of measuring or a whole lot of reporting. But before we leave today, we will acquire some data from my Windows 10 system and visualize that data actually for a large number of systems, just so that you get a feel for what the techniques are going to be that I show you over the next 2 weeks. So today is all about PowerShell. Next week will be all about acquiring data. So we'll look at how we can pull data not just from our Windows systems, but also from systems like Linux and from security tools, maybe that provide APIs to us, even from infrastructure like our VMware devices or our Active Directory domains. And then part three is going to be all about taking this data that we've acquired and visualizing it for management and for our operations staff. So sometimes that visualization will be in dashboard software like Grafana. Sometimes it will be a quick visualization that we do right there in PowerShell. And sometimes we'll kind of split the difference and maybe build an Excel spreadsheet with something like a pivot table in it that makes it easy for someone to consume large quantities of information. We're also going to use these webcasts to introduce you to a technique that I call Elvis for compliance visualization. And you can see that I've kind of stolen from the data warehousing ideas here with the idea of extract and load, but then I don't want to just transform the data. I want to actually visualize the data in a way that makes it easier for everyone to make good decisions on it. And we'll do just a little bit of that Elvis technique today when we extract some patch data from some Windows systems and then visualize that data in a Grafana dashboard. But today is really all about PowerShell. In fact, this is one of the last slides that I'm going to show you today. My goal really for today is to just do demonstrations. So about 90% of the webcast, meaning starting in about a minute, is going to be nothing but demonstrations of what PowerShell is and how it works. And my hope there is that that will serve as kind of that long freeway on-ramp that will allow all of us to get up to speed with PowerShell before we start doing some of that more difficult work of measuring and visualizing in the next couple of webcasts. Now, because it's all demos, I've got a lot of pre-written PowerShell demonstration scripts. If you would like these for your own system so that you can run through the same commands that I'm doing, we've made that available for you as a download, and the link is on the screen, and Carol will be pasting that into the chat for you as well. It's a tiny little zip file. I think it's about 200K, and it's got all of the PowerShell scripts that I'm going to use for demonstrations here in class. So just a couple more slides about PowerShell, and then we'll drop into the demos. PowerShell is a scripting language, but it's also kind of an operating environment, and it's a little bit different than the other shells that you might have worked with if you come from a non-Windows PowerShell background. If you grew up in Unix using the Bourne shell, or in Linux using the Bash shell, or even in Windows pre-PowerShell where you use the command interpreter, PowerShell is completely different than that in that it is object-oriented. So the things that I'm dealing with at the command line with PowerShell aren't just text, they're actually .NET objects, and they have the capabilities that .NET objects have. And we'll take a look at that as we work through the demos today. Now, there are a couple of different versions of PowerShell that you might be working with right now. If you're working on Windows, you're probably using PowerShell for Windows, which is, well, stuck at version 5.1. Microsoft is no longer actively developing PowerShell for Windows. They will do security updates as needed, but they're not going to be adding any features to it in the future. Instead, they're really looking for all of us to move to PowerShell Core. PowerShell Core is cross-platform. It runs not just on Windows, but also on Unix-like operating systems like Mac OS and Linux. It's in a long-term support version, which is 7. something. Right now, we're on PowerShell 7.1. And it works with a slightly different version of .NET known as .NET Core, which is also cross-platform. So now, instead of showing you the next 50 slides that describe PowerShell, what I would rather do is just show you how PowerShell works. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we're just going to run a bunch of PowerShell commands and talk about what's happening in the hopes of giving everyone a good feel for, well, what PowerShell is capable of doing. And I have another poll question that I would like to ask you with regards to PowerShell, and that is, what's your experience been with PowerShell? So Carol, if you'll put that second poll question up for us. And let's see, we've got, it looks like a bit of a bell curve in our results here. Well over half of you say, well, I've used a little PowerShell. I've run some scripts or some commands. 15% of you say, I've never actually used it at all. And then we've got a few more that have written a few of their own scripts and use PowerShell regularly. And it looks like 5 or 6 of you gave the same answer that I did, which is PowerShell is my best friend and soulmate, and we stay up late at night and braid each other's hair. So for those of you that have spent a lot of time with PowerShell, this may be a bit of a basic introduction for you today, but I think it's necessary so that we can all get to the same place as we work through this webcast series. So the first thing that you really need to know about PowerShell is that it's completely object-oriented. If you've used a shell like bash, then you know that you can run a command and you can take the result from that command and you can pipe it through another command for processing. But really what I'm doing is I'm taking text out of one command, piping it in as text into another command. And that can be really very limiting in what I'm able to do with those results. With PowerShell, that's really not the case. With PowerShell, everything is going to be an object. So I'm going to create an object that we can work with here. I'm going to launch a few instances of Notepad on my system. And when I do that, you'll see Notepad come up here in the foreground. And yes, there really are 3 of them running. But I'm just going to kind of put those into the background. You can watch down here in my taskbar and you can see that yes, I really do have 3 notepads running. But I'm more interested in what can we do with objects that represent those notepad processes. PowerShell gives us a command called getProcess that allows me to see all of the processes that are running on my host. Now that's a lot of processes, so I don't really want to show you all of those. I'm going to ask it to show me just the ones that are actual instances of Notepad. And you can see here I've got apparently 3 copies of Notepad running, and I've got a little information about them. Well, what's the name of the executable or the process? That's Notepad. How much CPU time has it taken up? And things like how much memory is it using? That's actually the working set in megabytes. So we've got about 16 megs allocated to each of these PowerShell processes. But remember what I told you, PowerShell is using objects. What I'm actually getting back from getProcess is a set of objects that represent those running processes. Well, if you've been around object-oriented programming, you might have heard terms like properties or methods that are associated with objects. Properties would be data that we've got about the object, and methods would be things that the object's able to do. And I can query that by using this getMember commandlet. So I can see that these processes have not only properties like how many threads are running or what is the working set or the memory that's in use, but I've also got, if I scroll up just a bit here, some methods. So the object is able to tell me things about itself, and it's also able to do things to the object itself. So for instance, I see here I've got a method called kill. We'll come back to that one in just a bit and see if we can use that to stop those notepad processes that we have running. I can pull individual properties out a number of different ways. So one trick is to wrap the command that you're running in parentheses, which will tell PowerShell to treat the result of that command as an object, and then just query properties out of it. Like if I want to see just the ID numbers or the process IDs of my running notepads, then it's easy for me to query that. If I want to see just the amount of CPU time that's been used by each, then I can pull out just that property as well. But what you're often going to do in security or compliance work is gather a few of these properties and then usually process them in some way to give you information about what's happening on the system. So for that, I'm often going to use the select object commandlet. Select object allows me to specify exactly the properties that I want to query from that object. In fact, it even gives me a way of creating my own properties that I can calculate on the fly. So here I've asked for just the name and the ID number and the amount of CPU time that was used by each of these processes. Now remember, because these are objects, we've got properties available, which are information about the object. We've also got methods available, which are things that the object can do. And I think I'm about through talking to you about Notepad, so why don't we use that kill method that we looked at earlier and use that to kill these running Notepad processes that I have on my system. So right now, all three of my empty notepads are still running, but when I ask PowerShell to kill every process whose name is Notepad, then those will politely go away for me. It's that ability to work on multiple objects pretty seamlessly that really gives us a good bit of power in the PowerShell scripts that we can use in our compliance and audit work. So let's take a look at a different object here. This is going to be a date time object that gets returned by the getDate commandlet. So when I run getDate, it gives me a string. It says this is Thursday, January 7th, and I'm in the central time zone, so it says that my time is 9:47 a.m. But it's not really just returning that string to me, it's returning an entire object that has a lot of information about the date and time. And if I look at the members of this, you can see that I've got properties like what day is it or what's the day of the week. And then I've got all sorts of methods like take my date and convert it to a short date string. So let's see what that method would do. If I run getDate, treat that as an object, ask it to run its toShortDateString method, then I get back a US locale short date string, January 7th, 2021. But those properties are objects of their own. So when I run getDate, it's got a year property, and that year is actually an integer that I can pull out and do things with. Let's do that. I can see that the year is now 2021. Like a lot of you probably, I'm still getting the habit of saying that. And because that year is an integer, I can do things with the year, like maybe add 100 to it and see that, well, 100 years from now, it will be 2121. I can even use the add years method to get date to do something like add 3 years to the current date. And then let's take that and convert it to a short date string. And it's very easy for me then to get this object into a format where it's easy for me to work with whatever my reporting needs are. Now, while we're talking about dates and times, there are a couple of things that I run into quite a bit as I work with security tools. One of those is that I really want to just do everything in UTC or coordinated universal time. I mentioned earlier I'm in the central time zone. A lot of you who are watching are probably not. And for those of you that have had to do log aggregation or analysis, you know that this is kind of the bane of our existence. So we often, if we're in a multi-time zone environment, we'll use something like UTC. So getDate actually has a method for this called toUniversalTime that will now show you what time it is in Greenwich Mean Time. There's actually another mechanism that I can use there. getDate has an asUTC function that will also give me the time in UTC. So when you're gathering logs, when you're trying to do correlation of things across systems, actually using that UTC time can be helpful. And there's another date format that I run into quite a bit, and that is epoch time. Whoops, I see I added an extra H in epoch there. There's not an H actually in the middle of that. But the epoch time is related to Unix, and it has to do with the beginning of the Unix universe, which was midnight on January 1st, 1970. Epoch time is very simply the number of seconds that have happened since January 1st, 1970. A lot of our security tools output their times in epoch format, and some of the visualization tools that we're going to use as we go through the webcast series input time in epoch format. So it's nice to know that PowerShell's given us an easy way to do that conversion, and that is that we can use a Unix format or uformat flag with getDate and have it show us the number of seconds. Now, remember, everything we do in PowerShell is going to be an object. So if I ask PowerShell to give me a list of the services running on my system, I'll see a list of services, but what I'm really getting is a representation of a collection of objects that represent the services running on my system. So again, one of the things I do when I'm working with a new object is I'll run that getMember commandlet to find out what methods and what properties might exist with my services. I can see there are several things here. I could look at the status of the service to see whether it's running or not. I've got methods available for the service to do things like start or stop the service. So let's look at a few of those properties first. If I wanted to report on the services that were running on a host, I might look at things like the name of the service and whether it's running or not and how it's configured. Is it set for automatic startup? Is it manual? Or is it maybe disabled? And I can use that select object commandlet to allow me to pull just those properties. So this is a list of everything running on my system, or everything installed on the system actually, whether it's running or not. It tells me the status of the service, and it tells me what the start type is for the service. Now, if I wanted to sort by some of those things, there is the sort object commandlet in PowerShell. That will let me take input and sort it based on anything I want. And this is where we start getting a little bit more powerful than the text-based sort that we might have with something like the sort command in Unix. Because I can say here, I want to sort by status, but then I also, within that, want to sort by start type. And oh, just for fun, I would like to do that start type descending. So now you can see that I've actually been able to group these services together based on whether they're running or not and what their start type is. Now, this is a little bit hard for me to read because I can't see the headings up at the top of this table. So I can use one of the formatting commands in PowerShell. There are a number of them, but you're going to very frequently use format list and format table. If I use format list, it will show me the results now in list format, where I can see the property and its value for each of these services. So sometimes when I'm doing a one-off at the command prompt, that format list is a nice way for me to see what I'm dealing with here. As an auditor and as a compliance person, I often need to gather evidence that we can use in our reporting. And so a lot of times that means I'm going to write things out to files. And we've got a command in PowerShell called outFile that allows me to do this. So this time you're not actually going to see any results on my screen. Instead, I've now got a file called services.txt that has all of the information that we developed before. Remember that there are multiple versions of PowerShell that you may be working with right now, so sometimes it's worth checking to see which one I'm actually dealing with. I'm running PowerShell Core here, version 7.1. That information is available to me in a built-in variable in PowerShell called $PS version table. That PS version table, interestingly, actually is an object that represents the version of PowerShell that I'm running. In fact, if I take a closer look at that PS version property of PS version table, you'll see that it's actually an object with properties of its own, the major and the minor and the patch number of this particular build. Now, there are a lot of commands available to us both in Windows PowerShell and PowerShell Core. If I want to get a list of all of the commands that are available, I can run the get command commandlet. And then I can just wait for a second because that's going to take a little while to run. There are a lot of commands available to me in PowerShell. If I want to get a feel for how many, and this is something that I often have to ask myself as an auditor and when I'm doing compliance work, how many domain administrators are there in the Active Directory domain? How many services are running? How many local admins are there on this particular system? The measure object command is a great help for that. So I'm going to run get command again, but this time I'm going to pipe it through measure object and let it count for me how many commands are available in my version of PowerShell Core here. It looks like we've got somewhere just shy of 3,000 commands available. Now, I really like measure object, so I want to take a minute just to show you how it works. So here I'm creating really an array of integers ranging from 1 to 5, and I'm going to ask measure object to show me not only the count of those, that there are 5, but also the average. In fact, you can see here that measure object allows me to do a lot more than just counting and averaging. I can ask it to do things like show me the sum of the numbers or the minimum or the maximum values or even things like the standard deviation. And I can specify for an object which property I want to do all of this math on. So you'll find that I use measure object a lot to help me get a feel for how many of a thing I might be dealing with. Now that get command commandlet that gives me a list of all my commands, I can narrow down the results a bit if I want by saying, you know, only show me the commands that have right at the beginning of their name. So here what I'm using is really just called a parameter. I'm passing a parameter called name and saying that I want anything whose name starts with right to be included in the results here. And parameters are really the way that we're going to manipulate the way that PowerShell returns things for us. I don't always have to specify the parameter name though. There are sometimes what we call positional parameters, which tell the PowerShell commandlet, hey, if I don't give you the parameter name, that just means I intended for it to be name, or I intended for it to be identity in something like get AD user. So that's a bit of a shortcut that I can use. And my recommendation to you as you learn PowerShell is go ahead and take those shortcuts at the command prompt if you want. But as you begin to write scripts for other people to use, it's probably better to be very explicit about specifying the parameters rather than kind of leaving it up to PowerShell to decide what you mean. One last note about PowerShell is that it is entirely non-case sensitive. In fact, you usually have to enforce case sensitivity on it with a special parameter or flag. So something like this would never work on my Unix hosts, but really any kind of capitalization or lowercase works just fine with PowerShell, with very, very few exceptions. Now, let's move on from that object-oriented nature and talk a little bit about how to survive in PowerShell, how to learn to live off the land if you're new to the environment. So remember that we've got that get command commandlet, And we can use this to break down the different types of commands that are available to us in PowerShell. Commandlets, and you've heard me use that term a few times now, those are going to be pre-compiled commands. Usually they're included as part of a PowerShell module that's either part of the base install of PowerShell or that you or an administrator have actually added in. So most of the work that you do in PowerShell will use commandlets. And you can see that there are a lot of commandlets on this system. And of course, being who I am, I would like to count those. So I'm going to ask PowerShell to show me all of the commandlets, pipe that through measure object, and you can see that a little bit over 1,500 of the commands that we noticed before, we had around 2,900 on the system. A little bit over half of those are commandlets. If I want to find only commandlets, maybe that have job at the end of their name, maybe I notice this wait HCX job up here and I'm kind of interested in what other job things we have. I could say, hey, get command, show me only commandlets, but only ones that have job in the name. In fact, I can stack as many parameters onto the line as I want to narrow the results however I would like to. Functions are usually written in PowerShell. Often they're included as part of a module as well. And for practical purposes, they're going to work for you exactly the same way that a commandlet does. So on this system, again, it looks like we've got a lot of functions installed, including, interestingly, the way that you change your drive location in PowerShell is to actually run a function that then runs the set location command for you to set you up on the correct drive. And let's see, it looks like I've got a few things here from the storage module. If I want to see only those functions that were included in the storage module, I can run my get command and tell it that the module I want to look at is storage. Now let's talk a bit about aliases for a minute. These aren't actually commands. These are things that point to real commands, and they make it a little bit easier for you to navigate the environment. Maybe you grew up in the Unix world, and so you know that if you would like to list the files in a directory, you're going to use the ls command for that. Or maybe you grew up in more of a Windows environment, and so you know that if you want to list the files in a directory, well, of course, you would use the dir command to do that. Or maybe you really grew up in the PowerShell world and you know that the command to list the files in a directory is get child item. Or maybe you're a lazy administrator who doesn't like to type the long names of commands, so you know that you can run GCI to get a list of all of the files in the directory. So it looks like we've got 4 different ways that we can list files in PowerShell. But what's actually happening is whether I run GCI or LS or dir, I'm actually running get child item because that is the PowerShell command to list the files that exist in a directory. So if I want to see only those aliases that are installed on my system, I can say get command and show me the aliases. Now there's actually another way to get that information. There is a get alias commandlet, and it will give me roughly the same information that each of these aliases actually points at something else. So again, maybe you grew up in Unix and you're used to the remove directory command. Well, that's going to actually just be a shortcut for remove item in PowerShell. So if you're shoulder surfing your administrators and you notice them using some of these short commandlets and you want to figure out, what does this actually mean, you can use that get alias commandlet to do that. So maybe you see an administrator type GSV and get some results on the screen. You can find out what that alias is by doing get alias GSV. And I can see here, that's actually that get service commandlet that we were looking at earlier. PowerShell will also run applications for you, and it's able to run anything that's in your path. Well, that path is saved as an environment variable in Windows, and it's available to us on a special PowerShell drive called $env. So here I'm looking at just my path. This is all of the directories that PowerShell would search in if I asked it to run an application. So you can see here that that env is actually a drive that has all of my environment variables in it. So I can see the path right here, but it's got other things like the path extension. If you try to run an application, it will look for this set of extensions for whatever command name you typed. Now, I mentioned this idea of parameters earlier, and I want to explore that just a little bit more. So here I'm going to ask get command to show me only applications, and I'm using that command type parameter to do that. And this will eventually give me a list of all of the executables that exist within the path on my system. There are going to be a lot of these, and of course I'm going to want to count and see how many there were. So let's just see how many applications we have. So of that 3,000 or so executable things that I've got in PowerShell, about 827 of these here are actually applications that I can run. Now, remember that parameters can be positional, so I want to get you used to seeing some of this. So now I'm going to say here, I would like to look at all of the applications, but show me only the ones whose name starts with the word task, followed by anything. That asterisk there is a wildcard. I'm not actually saying dash name task star. I'm just saying task star using that positional parameter. That will show me all of my executables that have task at the beginning of their name. Now, if you've been paying close attention, you'll notice that all of the PowerShell commands I've used have had exactly the same naming format. They all have a verb followed by a hyphen, followed by a singular noun. So you can actually find out the verbs that are commonly used in PowerShell using the get verb commandlet. That gives you a list of all of the verbs that are used by the built-in PowerShell commands. You can also search for only particular nouns. So get command has a parameter called noun that will let me find everything that interacts with services on my machine. Now, notice that I use quotation marks there around that noun. It was completely optional there, but there are times that you need to use quotation marks. So let me just talk to you briefly about how we use those in PowerShell. In general, I'm going to use single quotes around my strings. Double quotes will work equally well, but there are some differences in the way that they behave. So here I'm using single quotes. I'm just going to ask PowerShell to write out to my screen the word hello, and it does. But if I've got variables that I'm working with, like that PS version table that we talked about earlier, I'm going to write it into a shorter variable name, $V. If I want to print that variable to the screen, I can't use single quotes because single quotes will treat the things inside them as literal text. So if I say here, I want to write out to the host, your PowerShell version is $V, that is going to literally write out your PowerShell version is $V. If I want to expand that variable, I really need to use double quotes. And now I'll get back the information I wanted. My PowerShell version is 7.1.0. There are some other things that I can do with strings that are a little bit different in PowerShell than in other languages that you might have worked with. So I want to show you escape characters here. If you've worked with a language like Perl or Python, or if you've worked at the bash command prompt in Linux, you've probably used backslash as an escape character. PowerShell uses what's known as the backtick or the grave accent. So if you've got a US keyboard and you look up right under your escape key, you've got that tilde key. That character at the bottom of the tilde key, that is the grave accent. So here what I'm saying is, I'd like to write out column 1, followed by a couple of tab characters, and then write out the string call2. And you can see that I got a couple of tabs inserted here. Or I could do the same thing for a new line. Backtick in would give me a new line character. If I want to get help on how all of these commandlets work, there's actually a built-in mechanism for that called get help. So we looked at get service earlier. Let's get some help on how it runs. Well, here's the basic help for get service. These are the different syntaxes that you can use. And it even tells me a little bit about the aliases for it. And it says, hey, there are some ways that you could get more information about this. But maybe you grew up in Linux and I'm not going to remember get help. Can't I just use the man command? Well, yes, you actually can. If you run man, it actually runs help, which is an alias for get help, but it runs get help and pipes it through the more command so that you can see things one page at a time. So get command here shows me that I've got a function called help that's going to run that get help commandlet for me. I really like the online flag. If you want to make sure that you're getting the most current version of the help for a command, you can run get help and ask it to give you the online version. That will open your default browser and take you to the Microsoft help site for the commandlet that you're interested in. This is really nice if you want to make sure you've got the most current information, or if you just prefer seeing things in an environment where you can easily do a Control F to find whatever you're looking for. You can get help for specific parameters if you would like. In fact, I've got a few other get help commands here that we're not going to take the time to do. But if I want to say for get AD user, show me every parameter that starts with F, that will let me know that there is a filter parameter and give me a little bit of information about that particular parameter. It's a good idea to occasionally update your help files. I'm not going to do that in the demo here because that takes actually several minutes to run. And so instead, I'll just leave you with the commands in the script. You can run update help to update everything. You can even create a directory and download the help files into that directory and use that for offline updating if maybe you've got some machines that are not internet connected, but you want them to have the PowerShell help files on them. Now, I don't have a whole lot of time left with you, and so I'm going to give you just a few examples of how you can do selecting and sorting with PowerShell, and then I want to do a real measurement with you about something that we often run into as auditors and compliance and security folks. So I probably won't do this entire script with you. We'll talk just a little bit about selecting and sorting, and then here in about 4 or 5 minutes, I'm going to show you how we can use some of the techniques that we're going to use in the other webcasts to not only gather this information, but visualize it. So remember that we've got that get member commandlet that we can use to figure out what members are associated with an object. So here I've run get member on get service, and I can see all of the methods and all of the properties that are available. This is often the first step I'm going to take when I'm beginning to gather data for my compliance work. So I'll often look at just those properties because that's going to be the information I'm really interested in, and then just kind of pick and choose the ones that I'm interested in. So maybe I'm looking at things like the status or the start type or the name of the service. I can then use those as I do queries later on. Or maybe I'm an administrator and I'm interested in what services are able to do. I could look at the methods that are associated with that. So let's look at an example of when we might need to do this sort of thing. So I'm going to ask my Windows machine here to give me its network adapter configuration. And okay, it looks like I've got a couple of NICs in here, and I can see the names for them. There's the kernel debug network adapter, and then it looks like I've got an Intel gigabit adapter in here as well. But I kind of get the feeling that Windows actually knows more about my NICs than this command is showing me. So I'm going to show you kind of a shorthand way of doing a get member, and that is, let's just run this through select object and ask it to select everything for these two NICs. And now you'll see I actually get back a lot more information. So I've got things like what is the MAC address, what is the subnet mask that's associated with this NIC, what is its default gateway. And if I scroll up, I'll see a number of other settings like its IPv4 and v6 addresses. So I will often do this just by using the shortcut for format list, asking it to show me all properties. And I'm going to get exactly the same results as we just saw here. It's just a little bit faster to type at the command prompt. So as I'm doing my audit or as I'm gathering my compliance information, I might need to gather out just a few things. Let's get the description, the MAC address, figure out if DHCP is enabled and the IP address for each of these NICs that we're interested in. And if I want to make this a little bit easier to read, like I can see I've got a number of IP addresses here, I could pipe that through that format list commandlet, and it makes it a little bit easier for me to see some of this data. Now that select object allows me to do some interesting things, like let's look at only the first 5 things that got returned. When I'm first working with new objects, sometimes returning everything can be a bit much. Get process would be an example of that. If I'm really just interested in what the data looks like, I might tell it, hey, just show me the first 5 processes. Or show me the last 5 processes. And you can see here that obviously it's been sorting them by name because my first one started with A, B, and C, and my last one's ended with X, Y, and Z. I can skip a few if I would like. That can be very interesting. It turns out I've mostly got VS Code running here, so that makes that not super interesting. But you can see that we skipped application, frame host, and browser broker, and now it's showing all of the different instances of VS Code that I have running. And we can do these calculated properties, and this is probably what I'm going to end with for you on this demo so that I can show you some real measurement and visualization today. Calculated properties are a way of select object letting me build my own properties on the fly. So here I'm going to do an integer array, the values from 1 to 5, and I'm going to select out of that array a new property, and I'm going to name that property original, and it's just going to have the value of whatever object got passed in. That's what that $_ variable does for me. But I'm also going to create a second calculated property, and I'm going to use a shortcut here. I don't actually have to give it the word name. I can just say n equals double, and e, or expression, equals, take whatever came in and double it. Just multiply it by 2. And when I do that, now I've created my own properties for this object. I've got one that I've named original, that is the original number, and I've got one named double, that is double whatever the original number was. So I think that's a good place for us to kind of put a bit of a pin in this so that I can show you some measurements and some visualization using PowerShell and the Graphite and Grafana tools that we're going to use in our other webcasts. Let me show you the other files that I've got in this directory here. Actually, I don't need to use those. So let me just go straight to showing you something that that I will frequently do on audits and something that I do with compliance dashboards pretty frequently. And that is, I'm interested in the patches that are installed on a system. So I've got a command for that in PowerShell called get hotfix. And it gives me a list of all of the patches that have been installed on this system and the date on which those were installed. Well, that's kind of interesting to me right off. So I will often run this through sort object for installed on so that I can kind of get a feel for how often this system has been patched. And some of you who do compliance or InfoSec work should be cringing a little bit right now as you look at this system. It looks like it was patched a few days ago, so that's nice. But then prior to that, it was about 7 months or 8 months before that was the last time it was patched. I don't think we're on a very good patch cycle with this particular system. And so I'd like to kind of work with that. Let's pull a little bit of information from this host that might be useful for figuring out how often are we really patching and how long has it been since this system was patched. So you could do a trick like this. Get hotfixes, sort it by the installed on date descending, in other words, show it in reverse order, and then show me just the first one of those. That will give me a feel for the last date on which a hotfix got installed. And I can use a PowerShell command called new time span to figure out how many days ago was that. So I'm going to run get hotfix, find that most recent hotfix, and use that as my start date. And then as my end date, I'm going to do, well, today. And I'm going to ask myself, how many days has that been? Well, it looks like it's been about 5.5 days since this particular system was patched. Now, another test that I will frequently do is what I call patch velocity. So this one we call patch age. How many days has it been since the system was patched? Patch velocity is how often are we patching and how many patches got installed on those dates. So for patch velocity, I'm going to run get hotfix again, but this time I'm going to ask it to group those hotfixes based on the date on which they were installed. And that gives me something like this. Well, on January 2nd, we installed 4 hotfixes, and back on May 11th of last year, we installed 2. So that lets me see kind of the effort that's being put in by the administrators on actually patching these systems. So let's pretend that for the last year, we've been running these 2 tests against 100 different servers on our network. We've been gathering every day, hey, if any patches got installed, what were they and what was the date that they got installed on? And then we've also been doing this grouping for patch velocity to get a feel for how often things were being patched on the system. And I'm going to look at just one of those with you, and that's going to be the patch age. What if we'd been measuring over the last year, every day, how many days has it been since that server was last patched? So I've got a little script that I wrote here that's going to kind of generate that data for me for a year for 100 different servers. So I've got the patches.csv file here, and I'm going to have another one called patchage.csv. So that's finished. Let's take a look at that patch age file. I can see that it's got a record here of on January 9th of 2020, server 0 had a patch age of 0, meaning it must have been patched that day. And server 1 must have been patched the day before because it has a patch age of 1. And then we kind of work our way down from there. So it looks like about a year ago today, all of these servers were, well, fairly well patched, at least for the 9 that I'm looking at here. So I'm going to do one of those calculated property tricks, and I'm going to gather from that patch age CSV a feel for each server on each date, what was its patch age. But I'm going to express the date in epoch format. And the reason that I'm doing that is the tool that I'm about to import this into really wants for that to be in epoch format. So that looks pretty believable to me that on this date, I've still got the same patch information that I saw from the CSV. So I'm going to import this into a time series database called Grafana that I've got running on a different server. So I'm going to take all 365 days worth of information for 100 servers, and I'm going to import that into Grafana. It'll take just a few seconds to do. And while that happens, I'm going to jump over to my web browser that I've got logged onto my Grafana dashboard, and I'm going to create a very quick dashboard based on this data. So I imported that data as a Grafana data source called patch age. And I'm going to ask Grafana here, let me just make that a little bit easier for you to see. I'm going to ask Grafana here to show me patch age for all of my servers. Now that's going to create kind of a messy graph because I've got 100 different servers on here now. So I'd like to really kind of reduce that data a little bit. And I'm going to do it by saying, I would like you to just show me the average of the patch age for all 100 servers on each of the days in the last year. So let me have it show me here just the last year. And you can see we've got kind of an interesting little sawtooth graph that this produces for me. So let's pretend for a minute that in my organization, we have a 30-day patching window. We expect that our servers will be patched sometime within each 30-day window. Well, 30 happens to be the top of my graph here, so it kind of looks to me like we're actually doing pretty well over time, I see the patch age going up, but as we patch servers, then it comes back down. This is the sort of cyclical wave that I would really expect to see with regular patching. So at this point, I would say, okay, on average, it looks like you're probably pretty good. Now, this isn't a perfect measurement of how secure the environment is. I mean, I could have not installed all the patches last time I installed, but it still would count in the patch age. But it's something that management can look at to get a feel for how is patching going in the environment. So at a brief look, I would say it looks like you're probably not doing too badly on patches. On average, you seem to be getting everything patched within every 30 days. But let me show you something if I look at this a little bit differently. Instead of averaging that series, let's graph the maximum from that series. So I'm going to change my function here to max of the series. Now I'm seeing a little bit different information. So my max built all the way up to a high of about 166 days here and about 166 days there before actually going back down. And in fact, there were times throughout this whole period that it looks like I had at least some servers that were out of compliance with that 30-day window. So what's actually happening here is that it looks like maybe not all of my servers are actually being patched very well. So let me show you a way that I will often look at this. I'm going to convert this from a graph to a table, and I'm going to do a little bit of a transformation here. I would like to reduce this and let it just show me the maximums for each of these. And now if I look across these servers, I can see that there are a number of them that look like they were out of compliance over time. In fact, I can sort by that max. And we've got a few here that really seem to have been kind of problem children that we might want to ask management about. So on average, I would say, yeah, we're probably doing a pretty good job here. But being able to visualize it like this lets you answer the harder questions of, are some of them out of compliance? Can I tell which servers that was? Can I go back to management then with questions about this? That's also going to get me pretty close to the end of our time for today. So I know that Carol has been collecting questions, but I also know we've only got just a few minutes left here. So Carol, at this point, I'll say, if you've got any questions that you would like to pass on to me, this would be a great time to do that.
All right, thanks, Clay, for that great presentation. One person says, awesome, thanks for your time. This next one came in about 10 minutes ago, and it says, can you do like every 5 on this list? I asked them to rephrase, but maybe you know what they mean.
Yeah, so I think they were probably looking at when we were doing the skip with select object. You can in one way. There's an index option that you can use with select object to tell it which index you're looking at. And using a little bit of creative math, you could probably use the index option as a way to do that. That would probably be your best bet there.
All right, thank you. The next one says, how to add PowerShell module offline.
So that is a little bit trickier. When you have a system that's offline, and I know that a lot of us run into this with things like servers that are not allowed to be connected to the internet, but you can do it. You can download the module file itself, and you can copy it into either the per user or the per system modules directory that exists in your version of PowerShell. Now, the directory changes a little bit depending on which version of PowerShell you're using. But usually there's going to be what's called a PSM1 file, that's the module, and maybe a PSD1 file, that's a manifest that goes along with it, that you would copy into that directory. We actually use that technique when we build the virtual machines that we use in a lot of our classes, because we're building those machines with an automated script, and so we just download the modules offline and copy them into that directory. So it can absolutely be done as long as you can get to a file share from the system you're talking about.
All right, thank you. Does 557 have an exam?
So there is no exam for 557 yet. We're still in beta right now. In fact, the beta is a 3-day version of the class. We would expect probably within a year or so that we'll actually grow 557 into a full 6-day class by expanding some of the cloud material and adding some testing of DevOps environments. So for right now, GIAC has not designed an exam for 557. I would think we may be as much as a year or 2 away from that being the case.
Thanks. Do you have a few extra minutes here, Clay, to continue, or should I just pass the questions up to you to respond to later?
Yeah, so I think it would be probably better at this point for you to just pass anything else that you have to me, and because I think we're right at the end of the webcast.
All right, great. I'll be sure to do that. All right, well, thank you so much, Clay, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast. Oh, I do want to pass one thing along to you, Clay. A compliment here before we log off. It says, this presenter is one of the most knowledgeable auditors on the planet.
That's worth turning the camera on so I can smile about that. That is one of the best comments I've gotten today. So thank you for that.
Sure, sounds good, and we'll see you next week.